Hey everybody, this is John Fisk at the Wallace Center, and I want to welcome you and thank you for attending. Today's cluster call is about a very timely and important issue, food safety, that really does have an application for small, medium, and large farms, and has implications for local and regional food systems alike. This cluster call is brought to you by the National Good Food Network. The National Good Food Network is just what it is. It's a national network designed to help people doing regional food systems do a better job, to access resources, and to increase their learning so that we can reach more consumers with healthy food, we can affect more acres with sustainable development, and bring more viable economics to regional food systems and farmers. So with that, let me introduce you to Steve Warshawer, who's going to be our host and first presenter for the call today. Steve is a farmer in New Mexico. He operates the state's oldest CSA. He's been involved in building local and regional food systems in the Southwest since 1977. He's currently employed full-time at the La Montanita Co-op as the Enterprise Development Manager for the Cooperative Distribution Center. Steve's also been kind enough to work with us at the National Good Food Network as our food safety coordinator. He's going to be leading off the panel today and then introducing you to the other panelists and then managing the questions as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, John. This is the first time I've been on a webinar, so hopefully I'll handle the technical and related requirements well. The National Good Food Network is a network of regional lead teams who are working together, as John described, to scale up and help more local and regional produced food come into the food system. And in the work of the network, the facilitators noticed a constant recurring theme is that issues around food safety were a constant recurring theme. And the Advisory Council regularly reported that issues about food safety were part of their work on the ground, and almost all regional lead teams were involved in some fashion in doing food safety work. The need to be effective in implementing food safety practices and dealing with the changing food safety environment seemed important. It is relevant to small and medium-sized producers, especially those who are interested in scaling up. So given the recurrent topic of food safety, then the facilitators decided to begin a conversation within the Good Food Network about how it could participate in food safety work and improve performance of the regional team leads and hopefully others on the ground in regard to implementing food safety practices and dealing with the changing environment. So in this first phase of the entry of the network into food safety work, the first step was to engage the Administrative Council, and this was done through a series of conference calls addressing topics of interest to council members. And another aspect of this first phase was to study and report on the current food safety landscape. And that meant looking at the legislative initiatives, looking at particular challenges on the ground as buyer requests for different food safety compliance began to come forward, and then also to make some recommendations to the council and the network as to what else might be done. Now, what we learned from engaging the Advisory Council is that most Advisory Council members that are working in food safety are involved in practical, hands-on work. They're involved in supporting on-farm training, supporting verification of best practices, or in many cases, supporting farmers to prepare for GAPS training and this sort of thing. The goal of these regional teams working on the ground was to help folks who were not yet engaged to the food safety system to get on the ladder of food safety, so to speak, so that they could begin to move to greater levels of compliance, greater levels of preparedness as they also sought to scale their operations up and deliver more good food to more buyers within the Good Food Network, and as a result of its work. We were finding that there's sort of a collision of purpose in that process, because most of our farmers and many of our regional team leads were not necessarily prepared to meet all of the buyer and regulatory requirements, and therefore these requirements presented a barrier. Now, within the National Good Food Network are a range of players. This is a network that includes buyers and distributors, NGOs who are involved in supporting on-the-ground work of farms and organizing farms. And so with that range of participation, that gave us a perhaps slightly unique perspective on food safety as compared to other conversations where the focus might be specifically on needs of farmers or specifically on needs of buyers and that sort of thing. Now, as we move forward in the dialogue here on this webinar is our first chance to also include you in the conversation. What we found in evaluating the current food safety landscape is that the existing initiatives are all involved in different ways in attempting to assure buyers of food safety compliance and in satisfying consumers about the safety of our food. This grouping of initiatives has been driven by the public perception of less and less safety in our food system and public loss of confidence in that food system as a result. But with so many things happening at once, so quickly, the initiatives are often seeming in competition with each other. It's hard to sort out all of the different changes that are going on and how quickly they're going on. It's kind of like a mad scramble to attempt to implement and satisfy buyers, and also in so doing to increase public confidence in the food. The upcoming legislation, as it attempts to sort out that set of conditions, could help. But in the haste that is present in the rapid change that's afoot in the food safety environment, we must always be alert to and aware of possible unintended consequences. And that's the role that one of the things that I think is very important about keeping this multi-stakeholder and multi-industry conversation going within the Good Food Network, and then also passing our thoughts, ideas, and experiences out to other organizations that are involved in the work. That's to be sure that unintended consequences of the larger movement for food safety don't come back and unintentionally harm us. We need to be proactive, and we need to engage those processes as much as possible. So through the 2-month the 2-month pilot phase of our conversation, we came up with some specific recommendations as to what members of the Good Food Network need in order to improve our readiness to meet food safety requirements and to also improve our ability to impact the environment as it changes around us. The recommendations include improved and increased training for farmers in GAPS and in food safety in general. They include developing methods for certifying small farmers and small farmers in groups in a cost-effective and timely fashion. We also see the importance of developing tools for self-assessment and farmer planning in relation to food safety. So this includes developing farm food safety plans, on-farm training manuals, all the various attributes and elements of a effective food safety program that generally are much more accessible to larger farms with larger resources. We've got to develop our own tools to make those, deliver those services to smaller and medium-scale farms that are trying to become better able to meet the requirements of buyers as we scale up in the delivery of good food. We also we found that there's a need for us to be engaged within the Good Food Network in the policy process in order to inform it, but not so much in order to drive it or attempt to drive it. And this involves significant ongoing education about the different federal initiatives. And then as a last deliverable in this first phase of our work, we developed an FAQ on food safety. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I think I got it. And the idea behind this FAQ document was to begin creating a common language. Many of us hear words used to describe food safety components and don't know what they mean. And if we want to have a conversation, we've got to have a common language. So the food safety FAQ is a kind of a primer, if you will, carrying elements of the food safety policy and the food safety practices and trying to define those terms. It will be a living document. In other words, there will be new terms being added, there will be new concepts being added, there will be concepts being clarified as we go forward. And that FAQ is available now on the link that you see on your screen. And moving forward, the next 6 months, Good Food Network activities will include monthly advisory council calls on food safety. We plan to expand participation in those calls to a wider audience than the administrative council members who have been the participants, largely been the participants for the first 2 months. And we're also going to continue trying to identify and, if possible, help develop needed farmer and food producer training tools. So if you have anything that you know of in that regard and you want to help us spread availability of that information, send that to us at the email address you see on screen now, contact@ngfn.org, and we will function in a way as a clearinghouse and information control point or flow-through point to pass information around the Good Food Network. We will, whoops, I need some help here. I had to go backwards one. Sorry, folks, I just passed you across one slide. Thank you. We will keep the FAQ updated. We will continue to work with other organizations, national organizations and coalitions that are involved in parallel work, such as the National Sustainable Ag Coalition and the National Organic Coalition. We'll present NGFM members with opportunities to comment. We're planning some type of public input sessions 1 or 2 times in the next 6 months, perhaps using this webinar approach, perhaps taking advantage of other national convenings of coalition organizations when there'll be sufficient opportunity for more people to join in the conversation. And then also, of course, we'd like you to suggest, if you have any ideas, how we can most be of help to you. So now I would like to pass the baton to our next presenter for today. We have 3 more presentations in the queue. First is Aimee Witteman and Ferd Hoefner presenting on behalf of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Aimee is the NSAC Executive Director, guides organizational development and long-term campaign planning, including ensuring a strong synergy between NSAC's policy and grassroots capacity building work. She's a past W.K. Kellogg Foundation Food and Society Policy Fellow and has an MS in Agriculture and Environmental Policy from Tufts University. Ferd Hoefner is the NSAC Policy Director and has been NSAC's Senior Washington, D.C. representative since 1988. He's worked on nearly every federal agriculture budget and appropriations bill, as well as each of the omnibus farm bills since 1977. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Aimee next, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. Let me just see if I can advance the slides from my end. While we're getting the slides switched over, I'll provide just a little bit of background on the coalition, and some of the, Ferd and I are going to be talking specifically about some of the federal legislation pertaining to food safety that's going through Congress this year. But the NSAC, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, is a grassroots coalition of now about 75 grassroots organizations around the country that work with farmers and ranchers and together take common positions on federal farm and food policy to promote conservation and rural development, local and regional food systems, organic and sustainable agriculture practices. Our website is www.sustainableagriculture.net, so you can go to the website to learn more about our work and who our members are. just a little background on our work with food safety. In its 20-year history, NSAC and its predecessor organizations, the Sustainable Agriculture Coalition and the National Campaign for Sustainable Agriculture, have certainly been involved in food safety discussions, especially around things like the use of antibiotics, subtherapeutic antibiotics in livestock production, concentrated animal feeding operations, the use of chemical pesticides and other agrochemicals, and the regulations that are used in all of those cases. We have not been as involved at all with microbial pathogen contamination in fresh produce and food safety standards pertaining to fresh produce, which fall under the jurisdiction of the Food and Drug Administration. But that is where the current debate has centered this year, and many of our member organizations who work in the field with farmers have been deeply concerned by some of the food safety legislation and other initiatives taking place, and through our policy setting process advocated for food safety to be a major issue for the coalition this year. So we've been heavily involved with that, and as a way to sort of understand the issues and the landscape, we've developed a policy brief which is now available. We just finished it this week, called Food Safety on the Farm, and that's available on our website again, so I encourage you to check that out. But before we dive into the details of the federal legislation, I would just say that as a coalition, we really welcome the initiative of the federal government to make the food system safer and to decrease the contamination via microbial pathogens. But we have been concerned by some of the initiatives and the legislation that's been offered, which has taken, in our minds, a really one-size-fits-all approach, which doesn't recognize or promote the diversity of agriculture or is precise in developing measures for different sets of risk. Our members' ongoing concern is that certain practices and systems that are very fundamental to sustainable agriculture, such as integrated crop and livestock systems and value-added production, could be penalized by some of the provisions in the food safety legislation being considered, and other practices that the sustainable agriculture movement has been huge advocates for, that increase the transparency between consumers and producers, aren't being considered in the way that we think that they should, which is both, inherent to making local, regional food systems thrive, and also in some cases reduce some of the risks inherent with food safety issues. So that's a little background context where we're coming from on food safety work, and I'm just trying to advance our slide. So very briefly, and Patty and Russell will be getting into some of these other issues, this year there has been federal legislation that's been introduced on food safety, especially around fresh produce and the FDA. There's also been a new initiative, a new working group developed by the Obama administration, which has been involved with updating. Some of the first things that they've been doing is updating the guidances around good agricultural practices. So that's going on. And then there's also a proposed national leafy greens marketing agreement. But Ferd and I are going to talk specifically about the federal legislation. So there was a bill introduced. The bill that was introduced and passed through the House in July is HR.2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. And I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the main provisions in that bill that were of most interest and concern to our coalition, and then do the same for the Senate bill, and then I'll turn it over to Ferd, who will talk a little bit more about what we've been working on currently. HR.2749, in general, some of the things that it includes, and again, this is a bill that passed the House at the end of July. It includes new on-farm produce safety standards. It also updates or includes a provision that encourages or authorizes the FDA to update gaps in the next 2 years. It has a provision around food facilities, which are defined as farms that hold or pack food sourced from multiple farms or that process food and sell less than 50% of the farm's products directly to consumers, which are required to register as, it should say food facilities, not farm facilities. In the House bill, in addition to having to register as a food facility for farms that are doing that kind of on-farm processing and selling the majority into wholesale markets, is that those producers also have to pay a flat annual fee of $500 for all food facilities. HR.2749 also includes some new provisions around traceability systems for all food that's regulated by FDA. So that's fruits and vegetables and dairy and some egg products. Fortunately, we were successful in getting foods that are sold direct to consumers exempt from those new traceability systems and record-keeping systems. And grain, oilseed, sugar, hay, honey, and cacao products are limited to having to keep records for one up and one down. I'm just trying to advance the slide. The companion bill in the Senate is S.510, the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2009. And this is being considered by the Senate Health Committee right now. And Ferd, when he talks, will give a little bit of an update around the timeline for when this bill will be advancing on the Senate side. Similar to the House bill, the Senate bill includes new standards, food safety standards that extend onto the farm for produce. It also instructs the FDA to update the good agricultural practices. Unlike the House bill, does not include a fee for producers that do on-farm processing and sell more than half into wholesale markets. Those farms that do that are considered food facilities, and they do have to register. But unlike the House bill, they don't have to pay the flat fee. There is also, like the House bill, a new traceability system, but it's only for fresh fruits and vegetables. And unlike the House bill, it does not include an exemption for farms that sell direct to consumers. Neither bill includes specific instructions about the FDA coordinating with USDA or with the National Organic Program, which is one of the pieces that we've been trying to advance. I'm going to move now into a little bit of some of the issues in particular that we've been working on, and Ferd can speak more to those.
Aimee, there's a question from the audience about the one up and one down in regards to the traceability. Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah, this is Ferd. It simply means that you would keep track of your immediately prior person that you bought from and your first sale to wherever you sell your farm product to, but would not extend throughout the entire, would not follow that product throughout the entire food chain. So the farmer would be responsible for records just as far as who they bought from and who they sold from, but no further. So, and that's an important, very important distinction vis-a-vis the House bill, which would require farm facilities and everybody else, you know, regular processors, to have responsibility throughout the entire food chain, from all the way to the final consumer.
Thanks for the question. The this next slide just introduces our position, and this is taken from our policy brief, which is just, again, that we do welcome Congress and the administration taking steps to decrease foodborne illnesses. And I'm trying to advance this. But in general, we want to ensure that the measures that are taken are risk-based and focused on risk reduction, since there are different practices and also places along the supply chain that are more risky. Also encouraging the FDA to coordinate with state and federal agencies and community-based organizations that have food safety expertise or pre-existing standards or training programs, both as food safety standards are developed and also as the FDA considers mechanisms for enforcement. We want to ensure that the standards don't discriminate against but encourage diversified farming operations and conservation practices. There have been some food safety standards that in some cases have encouraged farmers to remove conservation practices or buffers as a way to, quote unquote, sterilize their farm, and we're deeply concerned by that happening and want to make sure that the standards that are the new standards developed don't do that, that the standards are appropriate to the scale of enterprise, that the enforcement and standards are closely coordinated with the National Organic Program, which already includes some food safety standards and measures that are a part of certification. And then finally, and this is an issue that Patty will be talking more about, but that marketing agreements and marketing orders aren't used to regulate food safety. And that's not specifically a part of the legislation right now, but is a part of this National Leafy Green Marketing Agreement. So I'll let Ferd now talk a little bit more about our position, getting into a little bit more detail around some of these issues that I mentioned are in the House and the Senate bill.
Yeah, so just a little bit on timeline of where we're at in the process. The Senate bill has not been taken up yet in committee. Even talking about the Senate bill is a little bit premature. The focus, everybody's focus of attention is on S.510, introduced by Senator Durbin, the Democratic whip, but the ultimate markup vehicle when it gets to committee will be based on 510 but different from it, and so everybody is quite focused on what those differences are going to be, and so we're in there with a whole lot of other interest groups trying to get our changes into that vehicle that will then go through the Health Committee in the Senate, and it should be obvious to everybody that the Health Committee is a little bit has their time taken up right now with health care and then with education reform after health care is done. So food safety is out there as something that is very likely to get done, but the timing of it is not at all clear. It could conceivably happen late this calendar year. It could just as easily conceivably happen next year, and a lot will depend on how fast or how slow healthcare and education reform go, since the same committee has jurisdiction over all that stuff. And significantly, another big piece of the background story in the Senate has been the death of Senator Kennedy, who chaired that committee for a very long time, and the new chairman now, Tom Harkin, former chair of the Agriculture Committee, coming over as chair of HELP. And frankly, on the issues that we're talking about today, though probably not for a lot of other things, it's probably an overall net plus to have somebody who ran the Agriculture Committee and certainly understands the issues that we're talking about now being the chair. And so I'm fairly optimistic about our chances of influencing the product that then goes through the Senate process. So that's just a little bit on timeline. I wish we could be more definitive about it, but that's about as much as anybody knows. Or if anybody knows more than that, they're the ones that aren't talking, so we'll leave it there. A couple other, I guess, big points. In the bills, in both the House and Senate bill, the produce standard section is obviously about fresh produce. The rest of the bill, as it intersects with farms, is much bigger than just produce. And that became a big issue in the House side because before the bill went to the floor, there was about the last week's worth of time and effort on the bill went to a negotiation between the House Agriculture Committee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee over the agricultural farm-related issues. And if I could characterize it in one broad stroke, those negotiations hinged mostly over two things. One, how much does USDA do vis-a-vis the Food and Drug Administration, and so that was debated at great length. And then the other one was exempting broad chunks of agriculture from either pieces of the bill or the bill in its entirety, so that the focus was on who's in, who's out, not on what is the policy for those who are in. And so we are trying to change the frame of the debate in the Senate to not, which commodity has the best, highest paid lobbyists to get them completely out or partly out, but rather, what makes sense for farms in general, what's good policy. So that's a pivot we're trying to make at this point, and I think there's some real receptivity to that. So then you could sort of divide our efforts into three major parts. One part is related to those overarching provisions that all hinge off of what is defined as a farm facility and what isn't defined as a farm facility. So we have a set of recommendations around that, and once that definition is clarified, that then triggers all sorts of other things, including preventative control plans, including fees in the House bill, and including various enforcement activities. So that's one big cluster. Another big cluster is the amendments we're trying to do to the produce standards themselves. And then the third one, and I guess the one I'll end on, is a new initiative that's just really come to pass in the last few weeks to add a brand new section, not in the House bill, not in S.510, to create an education, training, technical assistance, extension and outreach type of program specifically for small and mid-scale farms, both farms that would be subject to produce standards and farm facilities that would be potentially subject to the other provisions of the bill. And so we're trying to put that together, run it through USDA, put some dollars behind it. Of course, all the dollars for the bill as a whole have to be appropriated, with the exception of the small portion of the House bill that's fee-based, but it is a small portion. So by the entire Senate bill and most of the House bill is all, what really is going to happen on these bills is going to be a matter of how much the appropriators in future years actually agree to put up some money to do the provisions that are being debated. So the education, training, outreach, technical assistance piece is coming along. It does have a Senate champion in Senator Stabenow from Michigan. We're getting lots of signs of other senators wanting to be on board with that bill, and we expect it to be introduced in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And I guess I should leave it there.
Yeah, I'm just trying to advance to the last slide we have, but it was around timing. which Ferd already covered. So there we go. House bill passed in July, Senate bill expected to come up late this year, early next. And we're continuing to work as a coalition and with our allies in the National Organic Coalition on legislative language. So we'll pass it now. I guess back to Steve and then on to Patty.
Yes, thanks, Aimee and Ferd. Patty Lovera, who will present to us next, is the Assistant Director of Food and Water Watch, a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization with offices in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. Patty runs Food and Water Watch's food program and has expertise in issues such as meat inspection and mad cow disease, country of origin labeling, and dairy issues. And the topic she'll be presenting on today is the National Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement. Patty has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Lehigh University and a master's in environmental policy from the University of Michigan.
Thanks, Steve. This is Patty. Thanks, everybody, for getting on today. So I'm talking about one of the specific tracks we're dealing with on food safety all at the same time, the one at USDA, which is the proposal for a leafy greens marketing agreement for the whole country. Trying to make my slides work here. Eventually, we'll get to a slide where we can talk, there we go, about the timeline. So in September, just about 3 years ago, there was a very high-profile E. coli outbreak that was tied to spinach, and then later that fall there was some problems in lettuce from California, and that really triggered the leafy green industry, which is really centered in the West Coast, especially in California and Arizona, they kind of wanted to deal with the perception problems they had. They took a big financial hit from these outbreaks, and so they established a state-level marketing agreement for leafy greens under California state law. So they did that in 2007, and later that year in Arizona, that industry created their own state-level marketing agreement. Later that year, USDA did I think technically it was an advance notice for proposed rulemaking, but they did a comment period asking should there be a national version of one of these marketing agreements, and there was some time that elapsed, and this June, a few months ago, a list of proponents from the kind of the larger players in the leafy green industry made a proposal to USDA for a national version of a leafy green marketing agreement. That kicked off a whole process that USDA has to do as they consider this proposal, and right now we're in the middle of a series of hearings that the USDA is having across the country. They're doing 7 hearings in all, and we just finished the 5th one today that Steve was actually calling from. So in a minute we'll have another slide. We can talk a little bit about what a marketing agreement is. So marketing agreements and marketing orders are something that can happen under the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act of 1937. I will not recommend anyone read it unless you're having problems sleeping, but it does allow USDA to establish and maintain things that would help maintain orderly marketing conditions for agricultural commodities in interstate commerce. So some states can do this. They have laws that let them do it, but there's also a way to have national versions of this. So it lets the USDA set up marketing agreements and marketing orders, and they're supposed to do a couple of things. You can create minimum standards for quality. So this is how some things for specific regional promotion of products are done. And the goal is supposed to be orderly marketing. This is also the process that's used to set milk marketing orders, which some people are familiar with, which is how milk prices are determined. So there's 2 varieties of things you can get under this law. You can get a marketing agreement, which is voluntary. That's what we're looking at for leafy greens right now. Or you can get a marketing order. That's a mandatory situation, and so everyone who's growing that crop has to comply. But because it's mandatory, they do some kind of producer referendum. What we're dealing with for leafy greens right now, the proposal is for an agreement. The slide's going to change in a second, and we can talk a little bit about what would be covered under this proposal. So there's the list of crops that are considered leafy greens in this proposal. So it's not just lettuce. It's quite a list, ranging from some things that people don't necessarily think of, like parsley and cilantro, to kind of what we all think of when you talk about leafy greens, like spinach and lettuce and cabbage. The way that the proposal would work, that the marketing agreement would work, is that the entity that signs on, that agrees to be part of this agreement, are called signatories, and by signing onto the agreement, they say they will only buy product that was grown under a certain set of conditions and that pass an audit to say that those conditions have been met. In the language of marketing agreements, those standards or those conditions are called metrics. And the entities that sign on to the marketing agreement are handlers, which is an important distinction. Some marketing agreements and orders are agreed to by the growers of the crop. In this proposal, the handlers are the ones who would sign on. And the definition of what makes you a handler is that you receive, acquire, sell, process, ship, distribute, or import leafy greens. It doesn't include food service, retailers, or folks that just broker an item and actually never take possession of it. The proposal, the standards, the metrics that you would follow to be part of this agreement include good agricultural practices, so that's growing standards, good handling practices, which is in the processing stage, and good manufacturing processes, which would also be in that processing stage. One of the important issues that we're all kind of dealing with as we talk about this idea is that those metrics have not yet been developed. So the USDA is making a decision about whether this marketing agreement will go forward, but there's no standards yet to actually really examine and see whether they would be a good set of standards or a bad set of standards. What the USDA is deciding is should they set the wheels in motion to set up this structure, and then that structure would have committees and people that eventually write those metrics. The way that this functions is that people that sign up to the marketing agreement would pay, and the handlers would pay an assessment of up to a nickel per carton, and that would generate funds to pay for the administration, for the committees and the staff of the marketing agreement. It would pay for the audits, and it would pay for marketing, because the marketing agreement would ultimately end up with a seal that shows that this was produced and handled by someone who was a signatory to the Leafy Greens marketing agreement. So in terms of structure, the marketing agreement would have an administrative committee that runs kind of the whole thing. Underneath them is a technical review board that's responsible for coming up with the metrics. There's also a market review board. Their job is to get out the concept of a Leafy Green marketing agreement seal and that certification, and they're supposed to market the program and get people to respond to that and buy these products and feel more confidence in them. The whole thing is overseen by the Agricultural Marketing Service of the USDA, but one of the key distinctions is that USDA does have some kind of final sign-off authority, and that's become an issue in these hearings, but the core of it is being run by this administrative committee and the review boards, and there's a whole proposal. In the proposal, there's a whole thing spelled out about who would be on those committees. It's based on dividing the country up into zones, and there's been a lot of discussion in the hearings about whether those zones would be fair and would be representative, and I'll talk about that in a second. Just to kind of give you a sense of the players, this is the list of proponents. This is the folks that wrote the proposal to USDA to say we want a national Leafy Green marketing agreement. It just gives you a sense of this is the bigger players in the industry. I mean, these are the bigger producing states. It's the trade associations for the large growers, and all of this is available. Also, websites at the end. All of this is available, and you can see more detail there. This is a list of some of the folks who have turned up to say we don't want a Leafy Green marketing agreement. So Food and Water Watch is on there. Other consumer groups like Consumers Union, National Organic Coalition, a range of state and local associations, and there's also been a lot of individual growers who have shown up to say, I don't want this to be the way that we do food safety. So I'll spend just a minute kind of talking about what we're objecting to and what our problems are with this proposal. One of the points that people have been raising is this really voluntary for growers? Because growers are not the ones who agree to sign on. It's handlers, the wholesalers, the buyers who sign on to the Leafy Green marketing agreement. And if they're your market and you don't have anywhere else to go and they tell you, I'll only buy from you if you do these standards and you follow these rules, that doesn't seem so voluntary to a lot of growers, especially in a lot of parts of the country where this industry might be fairly consolidated and they don't have a lot of options to sell their stuff. Another kind of big picture objection that Food and Water Watch and a lot of the consumer groups have been raising is that we don't think that a marketing agreement and a marketing arena is an appropriate way to deal with food safety. We don't think that food safety is something that should vary by brand. And when you get into the venue of, this company is signed onto the agreement and this company isn't, that becomes just an inappropriate way for us to try to navigate telling consumers what is safe, and it puts a lot of burden on consumers that they're somehow responsible for picking the right brand, and quite frankly adds to the chaos in the market on this issue and doesn't reduce it. And the goal of these marketing agreements and orders is supposed to be to reduce the chaos. There's been a lot of concern that's come up at the hearings that this is a pretty consolidated industry. You know, the vast majority of leafy greens are coming from California or Arizona, depending on the season, and that this is going to be dominated by those interests, and whatever portion of leafy greens are being produced elsewhere are really going to be disadvantaged by the kind of imbalance in power. And there's been a lot of specific criticisms of the structure of the agreement, the way the zones, the way the country is divided up into zones, and what that means for the power in the committees that run this thing. Just one example of the zone structure, you know, Florida, which is obviously a pretty big powerhouse of producing fresh vegetables, is in the same zone as Vermont. And so is that even feasible for one person to represent that part of the country with that much geographic and climate diversity? And also, is there going to be any likelihood that the smaller states and the smaller producers get represented when they're competing for that seat or that spot with somebody from a large operation in Florida? So there's been a lot of specific criticisms of this proposal and the way it's designed. And then finally, there's been a lot of discussion about what have we learned from this experience of having a leafy green marketing agreement in California. So we're a couple of years into it. There's been a tremendous of this the response to the E. coli outbreak in spinach, what that's meant for the environment. And there's been a lot of concern that it's put the metrics that have been put in place, whether through the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement or through some private program that a buyer or a retailer makes you do, that those requirements have really been incompatible with water quality protection efforts, with wildlife, with biodiversity programs. The examples are things like requirements that there have to be huge buffers of bare earth between growing lettuce or spinach in a field and any other vegetation. Zero tolerance for wildlife on the farm, leading to things like, poisoning frogs and stuff like that. So there's been a lot of debate about what this has looked like in California, and without metrics, without developing the standards in a national agreement, it's time, that's all we have to look at. And so a lot of folks who are objecting are saying it's fair game to look at this California agreement and see if it's working or not before we decide to take something like it national. Similar discussions about the cost. If people are interested, I could post a study that the University of California Small Farm Program introduced at the Monterey hearing on this, where they talked about the cost of complying with these things, and there are different levels of cost for different sizes of farms, and I don't think that surprises anybody. And then another kind of big picture issue and criticism of the California experience has been that we are still dealing with audit fatigue is what a lot of people call it, that growers have to deal with as many programs as they have buyers. So if they have 5 buyers, they probably have 5 food safety programs, and that the California Leafy Green Marketing Agreement hasn't done away with those. It hasn't reduced the pressure of all of these private standards programs on the growers, and that in that way chaos hasn't been reduced. So where we are in terms of, in this proposal for a national version of this, the USDA has held hearings already in Monterey, California, Jacksonville, Florida, Columbus, Ohio, Denver, Colorado, and they just finished one earlier today in Yuma, Arizona. There are 2 more hearings coming up, one in Syracuse, New York, and one in Charlotte, North Carolina next week. And then at some point after that, USDA will make a decision to, yes or no, will we go forward with this proposal for a National Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement. So that's kind of a quick coverage of kind of a complex subject, but the last slide I have that's coming up in a second will be just some places to get some more information. You can read the materials, the proposal, and a lot of the testimony people have been giving on the USDA's website. The California Leafy Green Marketing Agreement has a pretty extensive website. You can read things, including what their metrics are. And then a lot of the folks who have been going to hearings and objecting and speaking out against this thing have put our stuff up at the National Organic Coalition's website.
All right. Well, and we're all moving as quickly as we can through this material, and I have to say that this is our common problem. We have too much material to deliver in too short of a time, and we're all trying to keep up with this. This is just an example, if you will, of the changing environment, rapidly changing environment we're working in. And last, now I want to introduce Russell Libby, the Executive Director of the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. Russell planted his first garden after getting free seeds at the end of 4th grade. His involvement with MOFGA started when he saw a connection between local organic food and a strong Maine economy, and he joined the MOFGA Board of Directors in 1983. After a dozen years on the board, including 2 years as president, Russell became Executive Director in 1995. Russell has a wide range of agricultural affiliations, including 10 years as Research Director at the Maine Department of Agriculture. He currently serves on many boards, including the National Organic Coalition and FedCo Seeds. He has a degree in economics from Bowdoin College and a master's in resource economics from the University of Maine, and operates a small diversified farm in Mount Vernon. And his first book, Balance, A Late Pastoral, was published in 2007. Thank you, Russell.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to move us through fairly quickly so that we're on track with having a few minutes left for questions here at the end. And I'm trying to forward, and we're not quite getting there. There we go. Basically, I'm going to skip all the policy stuff because you've heard a fair amount of it. We've been trying to figure out what an on-the-ground solution looks like. So MOFGA is 6,300 members, roughly. We have about 1,000 farmer members, 400 certified organic farms, hundreds of other people who are processors, and we also operate a USDA accredited certifier. So we're looking for policies that work all the way across. We started with a reaction to GAP, Good Ag Practices, which was the quick response to spinach a couple years ago. The link is here, and as soon as I read them, I said it doesn't work for small diversified farms. It doesn't work for farms that include crops and livestock. It doesn't. GAPs don't work for farms that grow a huge variety of crops. And over the last 3 years, it's become even more true that GAPs, even though they're being used as part of a food safety solution, really don't address underlying issues. We have been trying to build and are taking back out on the road again this winter a 3-stage system. By the way, I'm not going to read every word, so you're going to have to be reading while I'm talking. And our approach is really looking at first trying to get farmers trained on the ground in basic food safety protocols, whether it's basic sanitation or the issues that are generated that when you grow specific crops that already have regulatory barriers. Everybody should have access to basic training. We did a round of training a year ago. We just scheduled a round of training starting in January this year, taking it across the state, trying to get a bunch of our farmers and others who are interested. So this is not an organic specific process. Second, if you're a farmer or processor who produce items that have documented food safety risks, and documented is the key item for us, you should consider doing a food safety plan. And this is your document. It's to help you be aware of how you can respond when people have questions, and so you're more certain that your production practices are meeting basically state-of-the-art. And finally, we're looking at, and our certification program has agreed to pilot a verification protocol for farmers, processors who need it for access to markets. We're not so concerned about this right now because this is so fluid, but we think it's important to pilot it and see how it works. And here's the basic reason. In Maine, if you're going to do a GAP program, it costs you $91 an hour door-to-door for the State Department of Agriculture inspector. Some of our farms are 5 hours one way away from the nearest State Department of Ag inspector. It's about $1,000, and they want to inspect you for every crop. We're already sending organic inspectors to those farms. We want to train them so that they can provide this as an add-on and potentially at a significantly lower cost to the farmer. So basic training, we're doing workshops, we drew farmers, we have draft food safety plans. I may have hit the button too many times, and we'll see. Basic concerns about food safety are everywhere, even though they really, in general, are not traced back. But if there are a few problems at farmers markets, it's going to affect all of us, no matter where our markets are around the country. they're not going to have a big food safety impact in terms of impact on health, but they're going to have a big reputational impact. So all of us have some role to play in making sure we as farmers or we as people who work with farmers have helped our farmers get through the process.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing that I was going to talk about, I keep hitting buttons, but we're not moving very quickly. FDA has just issued guidances, and there are draft guidances for melons, tomatoes, and leafy greens. So whether federal legislation passes or not, whether a leafy greens marketing agreement passes or not, FDA is moving down the pathway of issuing guidances which are going to turn into rules for all these products, and comments on these are due at the end of the month. I'm going to pause there so there's at least a few minutes for questions. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, I think at this point in the presentation series, we're trying to open up for questions. And to any of us who've made the presentations so far, and as I understand the process here, continue to ask questions by typing them into the chat box, and we'll see how many we can respond to over the next few minutes and try and track the rest for follow-up afterwards.
I think, Steve, Ferd and I would like to, since there's so many questions about the food facility definition in HR.2749, and which farms would have to pay the fee, that we'd like to address that since it came up several times and there were a lot of different answers.
Okay, so this is Ferd. If I could try to boil it down to a nutshell, first you have to decide if you're under FDA or USDA. So if you're meat or poultry, you're under USDA, so just put those out of your mind for the purposes of this discussion. So for FDA, everything else, you're a food facility if one of two things happens. You either are commingling product, meaning that you're taking product from several farms and either packing or storing or doing anything of those kinds of activities with it. That makes you a food facility. So you're a farm, but you're a food facility because you're commingling product. The second big category is if you're a farm that does any kind of on-farm processing or manufacturing, that also makes you a facility. So that could be anything from, well, all maple syrup producers, for instance, would automatically be facilities because it automatically includes a processing stage. If you do, you make your own cheese or yogurt, that, from a dairy perspective, that would do it. If you're grow carrots and you're turning them into mini carrots, that makes you a facility. So there's a huge range of things that makes you a facility, even if you're doing it on farm. The exception in current regulation, but not in current law, but in current regulation, the exception is if more than 50% of your processed or commingled item is sold directly to consumers, then you're no longer a facility. In the House bill, that regulatory definition is codified into statute, and an additional exemption is added, which is if you're a farm that grinds or mills grain to sell to another farm, primarily as animal feed, but it also allows you to feed the other farmer. I get a kick out of that provision. That also exempts you from being a facility under the terms of the House bill. So I just wanted to clarify that because there seemed to be an awful lot of questions about it.
And it's just the House bill then that also, if you do qualify as a food facility and sell more than half into wholesale markets, that you pay that flat annual fee of $500.
And the fee, I should add, is it's $500 per facility. So if you're a Vermont dairy farmer that both is doing cheese and maple syrup, that means you get two fees. Right.
I'm wondering if there are any other questions that panelists have seen as we watched the question bar that they would like to step in and address as we continue. Okay. I'm trying to.
Steve, this is Ferd. I see that there's a new question about whether there's any chance for a sliding scale fee structure. I can answer that two ways. One is the presumption at this point is that the Senate bill will emerge without a fee structure. That's not obviously a given, but that's certainly what we hear constantly. And so you got the basic flat tax in the House bill, no fee or tax in the Senate bill. That means it will be a House-Senate conference issue at some point. I would think an obvious compromise point would be to go to a progressive or sliding scale fee schedule if, in fact, there will be a fee in the end, and there might not be. But if there is, that would certainly be a logical compromise to do it in a progressive fashion based on ability to pay, where there's a basic exemption amount up to a certain amount where you pay no fee, then another gradation where you're paying a low fee, and another gradation where you're paying maybe the $500, and then if it was truly progressive, there would be higher fees if you're ADM or ConAgra or Cargill or whoever, and have facilities that are employing hundreds and hundreds of people. So I do think that's a possibility. The other thing I would repeat about that is even in the House bill, the fees only cover about 20% of the cost of the bill. So even in the bill that has the fees, 80% is going to have to be appropriated by the Agricultural Appropriations Subcommittee in future years. And that would be 100% of the Senate bill.
There's a question from Elizabeth about how these rules will impact CSAs. And so far, virtually, it may depend on the. Is there anyone on the panel who would like to take that question?
Well, this is Ferd, or Russell, you can jump in if you want. But yeah, basically, if we just look at the House bill and we're trying to get the same provision into the Senate bill, if a CSA is only being a CSA and not also selling elsewhere, they would not be a food facility if they're doing any kind of processing. They would not be a food facility, so they would be out from under many provisions in the bill. But they would be, if they're doing vegetables, subject to the whatever produce standards ultimately become FDA regulations. And that will be a question of which ones are ultimately decided to be the, once they do a risk-based analysis, which produce actual crops they decide are the ones that are going to be regulated. And then on traceability, again, in the House bill, the food, not the farm, but the food that is sold directly to the consumer does not have to have any traceback mechanism. Again, if a CSA is 100% doing sales directly to consumers, then they would not have any traceback requirements.
Yeah, this is Russell. I think one of the complex issues, and it's showing up in a lot of these questions, hinges around this issue of a facility. And NSAC and NOC and a bunch of us from around the country have really worked hard to try to get the facility definition more clear with each conversation. It originally was hiding in the interim final rules for the Food Biotourism Act of 2002, and it's not clear. But what is clear is that it's a pretty inclusive definition as it's now out there. The question of produce safety standards is in an entirely separate section of the law. So whether we fix the facility definition or not in the Senate bill, the produce safety standards are another whole track that's moving, whether it's moving through leafy greens or guidances or rules or in legislation. And I think that's why it's so important for all of us to be engaged in these conversations. I think NSAC has some great stuff up on their website. MOFGA's put stuff up. Steve has been putting it up for the Good Food Network, and just feedback and continued conversations is going to be an important part of how we solve either solve it or at least are really clear about why we object to the final legislation that comes forward.
One other, this is Patty, just because it's a slightly different track, but this has come up a lot in the hearings for the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement, and it's interesting. It's a really valid point. We have to talk about it for the legislation, and I think we're all having good conversations about it for the legislation, but it's actually being twisted around by kind of big National Leafy Green Marketing Agreement hearings, and they're saying, oh, don't worry about us and this marketing agreement. If you sell direct, no one's a signatory, no one's a handler in a direct-to-consumer relationship, so don't worry your little head about our marketing agreement. And so one idea that a lot of folks have had to inject into these hearings is that it's not okay to have this marketing agreement or this private standard exist that becomes a barrier to ever becoming anything more than direct, to ever finding a wholesale market or growing a little bit or finding other ways to get into a different market, because if the things are written for the biggest of the big and they say, oh, don't worry, small producers will just leave you alone, are you going to be stuck there forever and never be able to get to a mid-size? And so it's been an interesting twist from the legislative arena, where we're having one set of conversations about it, to watch it get twisted around at these hearings for this marketing agreement.
There's several questions about, let's see, where did Stacy's question go? See if we could get some help on that one. Oops. There we go. How do we address the comments from large ag groups who say that what's fair is fair and we should have a level playing field?
I'll tackle that. I think FDA has already said that they know that the solutions for the largest businesses, whether they're distributors or facilities or farms, are not going to be universal solutions, and so they are actually looking for, in these guidances, responses on how they can be structured to be scale appropriate. And the director of FDA has said this in public, in writing, and I think we need to try to find as many ways as possible to hold them to it. But that's why I think all of us have a responsibility to make sure that farmers are aware of food safety issues and dealing with the basics at every level of the food system.
And another question that's come up in several forms is what about distributors, and particularly CSAs that distribute from other farms or small distributors? Are they facilities, and what are their traceability responsibilities?
Yeah, this is Ferd. I think the simple answer is if you commingle, you're a facility, and there's no, in existing regulation, there's no wriggle room on that. I'd also add that there are a few exemptions to what on the processing side doesn't count as processing, and rinsing produce and pulling off outer leaves of produce does not count, but just about every other imaginable thing does count, including just simply packaging or labeling your product does count as processing, and therefore makes you a facility. There is no, we've been asking this question for quite some time, how many farm-based facilities are there, and it's quite clear that FDA, USDA, or anybody else in the government, nobody knows the answer to that question.
Okay. There's a question up about farmers markets, and again, it circles back to the definition of food facility. Russell, could you share your answer on the status of farmers markets as you see it in relationship to this food facility question?
If you are a farmer and you're taking your product, and well, first, this is at least one FDA staffer's interpretation of this, and when I raised it, it's now gone to other FDA staffers to make sure they all agree. If you are a farmer and you take your product, whether it's processed or unprocessed, however the definition is, and you take it all the way to final consumer, or at least 50% of it, at one stage you're a farmer, at one stage you're a facility, and at the final stage you're a retail food store. And under that retail food exemption, that is, they don't want to regulate grocery stores and restaurants and everybody else in this legislation, you become something that looks like a portable supermarket that's only 100 square feet. And in that way, they are saying that you're exempt as a farmer's market, and you have a fairly broad ability to produce things. It's when you start moving into a wholesale market that the limitations start to emerge.
Okay,
and so farmers market would be an agglomeration of a bunch of retail food stores under that interpretation, tortured as it is.
Well, we're pretty much to the end of our time for the question and answer, and I want to re-emphasize Russell's comment that the major opportunity and responsibility that we all share right now is to stay as close as we can to the discussion, learn as much as we can from each other and from the process of both interpreting the material that's coming towards us from these different initiatives, and keep pounding our points home. And I think there's been a big change in a certain respect over the last few months, simply as a result of our effectiveness and our volume and our presence in making our points. And we are all part of that process. And in fact, one of the goals of this webinar and of the whole idea of bringing together this group of speakers was to give folks a sense of what the different touch points are in the efforts to stay ahead of the curve, keep learning as fast as we can, and keep responding and impacting the process. So I would encourage you to check our frequently asked questions posting on the Good Food Network. It has a list of resources which include those on this call and others. And hopefully that list will help by continuing to check those sites and check the information postings that we'll be providing. That will serve this process of helping us all be educated and helping us share concerns and information as this food safety avalanche moves forward. And I'm going to pass it over to Marty Gerenser now for final comments.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. This is Marty Gerenser, manager of the Good Food Network. You can find out more about the Good Food Network and what we're doing with other networks on food safety at ngfn.org. And also send us questions, comments, suggestions anytime at contact@ngfn.org. It's on the screen right now. We spend a fair amount of time, Jeff and the presenters have spent quite a bit of time preparing for this and thinking about the best way to present such a complex issue. Please let us know if it's working, if you'd like to hear more, if you'd like to go a little deeper into specific topic areas. We will be, as part of the Good Food Network and with other organizations like the ones you heard from today, we will be doing more with food safety to contribute to this regional food system work. So we want to know what you all are thinking and how we can best serve you as we work through these issues together. We hold webinars. The Good Food Network holds webinars once a month. The third Thursday of each month at 3:30 Eastern is a good way to remember it. The next one is November 19th, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, and we'll focus on our retailers, small and medium-sized retailers, how they work with small and medium-sized growers, how they work through some of these issues to work in a value chain approach. There will be a lot of different issues that we'll work through. We'll have the opportunity for question and answers from attendees. If you're not on the Good Food Network e-list, we invite you to sign up so that you can get reminders and information about the webinars, e-newsletters, and different pieces of information that we have. We're also on Twitter. We invite you can go to the website and connect to us there as well. We try to keep folks updated as often as we can in real time, just so that you folks know what we know. As soon as we know it, we send it on out through our outreach mechanisms. Again, we'd like to thank Steve and Jeff and all the presenters today. It takes a lot to put these together, and we felt like we put together a package that might be valuable to you. Please, again, send suggestions, and we hope you visit the website, and we hope the information we have is valuable. Thanks again. Talk to you next month.